By the winter of 1942, Stalingrad had become a city stripped of its own shape. Streets once lined with shops and apartments were now jagged corridors of shattered concrete, burned-out trolley frames, collapsing balconies, and drifting ash that fell like snow over a world remade by explosives. Nothing looked alive, nothing sounded human, except the occasional crack of a rifle or the grinding rumble of tanks navigating debris that had once been sidewalks. The Volga, frozen in places, resembled a sheet of broken glass stretching eastward, reflecting only the smoke trailing from refinery fires that had burned for months. Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a graveyard of angles and shadows. And in the center of that graveyard stood Building 47, a bombed-out factory skeleton that would become the unlikely fortress of a Soviet platoon vastly outnumbered by the German assault to come. Lieutenant Mikhail Sokolov had arrived in Stalingrad in late September, when the Germans were certain the city would fall within days. He was only 24, a quiet man with a narrow face and dark eyes that rarely revealed emotion. His platoon, what remained of it, consisted of 23 soldiers. Factory workers turned fighters, reservists, sappers, a few seasoned veterans from earlier battles on the Don, and 2 teenagers who had lied about their age to enlist. They were exhausted, hungry, and half-frozen, but they had learned something the Germans had not: how to fight inside a city that fought back with them. In Stalingrad, every pile of rubble was a shield, every staircase a trap, every ruined window a rifle barrel waiting for a target. Mikhail understood this better than anyone. He had no illusions of glory, only the certainty that survival required cleverness, discipline, and a willingness to become as patient and merciless as the city itself. Building 47 wasn't chosen because it was strong. It was chosen because it was broken in exactly the right ways. Half the walls were missing, allowing visibility across multiple streets. The upper floors had collapsed into jagged platforms that provided cover without blocking line of sight. The basement, though partially flooded, offered an escape route into the sewer tunnels that laced beneath the district. And perhaps most importantly, the Germans believed it was abandoned. In Stalingrad, that was as good as a weapon. Mikhail positioned his platoon carefully, machine gunners in the second-floor gaps where crossfire could intersect, riflemen behind interior rubble mounds that forced enemies into kill zones, grenadiers near collapsed staircases where the Germans would likely attempt to climb. He ordered everyone to conserve ammunition. "We do not fire until they step into our home," he told them. "This building will protect us if we do not reveal our presence too soon." What none of his men knew was that 3 German battalions, more than 3,000 soldiers in total, had been ordered to clear their sector block by block the next morning. The 6th Army believed resistance in the district was minimal. They had received reports that Soviet defenders were pulling back to the riverbank, preparing for evacuation. Command believed Building 47 to be a ruined shell not worth a second glance. But Mikhail had intelligence of his own, gathered from civilians who slipped between the lines at night, from scouts who reported German troop movements, and from listening posts who overheard fragments of enemy planning. He knew what was coming. He knew they would be outnumbered more than 100 to 1, and yet he told no one in his platoon. Fear was a luxury they could not afford, and shock was a weapon he intended to use. On the night before the German assault, snow drifted through the ruined window frames as Mikhail sat with his men around a small, shielded flame. They spoke little, each man lost in thoughts he would never share. Some cleaned rifles that had been used so often their bolts no longer scraped. Others wrote short letters they'd never deliver, tucking them into pockets as if the gesture alone preserved hope. Mikhail simply observed them. The faces shaped by months of siege, the eyes hardened but still human. He knew what awaited them the next morning. There would be no retreat, no reinforcement, no rescue. Only the building, their discipline, and their will. When dawn crept over Stalingrad on December 11th, it came with boots, engines, and shouted German commands echoing through the empty streets. The storm was arriving. and 23 men would soon stand against 3,000. The German advance began with a confidence that made the frozen air vibrate. Boots struck broken pavement in synchronized rhythm, the sound echoing off hollowed buildings like the march of an army that believed it had already won. A column of infantry pushed through the street north of Building 47, rifles slung comfortably, helmets dusted with frost, their posture relaxed in a way only possible when command has assured you the resistance ahead is weak. Behind them followed machine gun teams, engineers, and finally the darker silhouettes of assault pioneers, the specialists tasked with clearing close-quarter defensive positions. They advanced with practiced efficiency, scanning windows and alleyways, unaware that dozens of Soviet eyes watched them silently through cracks in the ruined walls. Lieutenant Mikhail Sokolov's platoon remained motionless. Breath steamed from their mouths, fingers tightened on triggers, but no one fired. Mikhail had laid down his rule. The first shots must not reveal positions. They must create confusion. Shock was their only force multiplier. Ammunition was precious, more precious than time, warmth, or food. They would not waste it on targets easily replaced. They would fire only when the Germans stepped into the precise intersections of sightlines Mikhail had spent days studying. The first German unit to approach the building did so casually, stopping to examine a fallen chimney that blocked part of the street. Two men bent to move debris while others lit cigarettes, weapons slung carelessly. To them, Building 47 was nothing more than another ruin, another silent, empty carcass of the city they had almost conquered. In the stillness before the attack, Mikhail whispered into the cold air, "Not yet." His men steadied themselves. The Germans crossed the invisible line. Then Mikhail raised his gloved hand and dropped it. The first shot did not sound like a rifle. It sounded like the building exhaling violence. Sergeant Ilya Morozov's machine gun erupted from a second-floor gap, the barrel flashing orange against the gray morning. The soldiers below had no time to react. 3 fell immediately, their bodies collapsing in a synchronized drop that froze the rest in place long enough for the second weapon to open fire. Private Yuri Antonov struck 2 German NCOs with single controlled bursts from a captured MP-40, his muzzle flicking with mechanical precision. Chaos rippled outward like shock waves. Germans dove for cover that didn't exist, scrambling behind rubble too small to shield them. Some fired blindly into windows, others shouted for direction, and a few simply froze, unable to comprehend how a dead building had just come alive with gunfire. Mikhail moved through the positions, adjusting angles, signaling reloads, tapping shoulders to maintain discipline. He remained calm, as if the violence unfolding around him were a choreographed performance he had rehearsed. More Germans poured into the street, attempting to flank the building, but Mikhail had accounted for that. 2 of his riflemen, stationed in the southern breach, waited as the Germans funneled into their kill zone. When the enemy exposed themselves fully, both Soviets fired in perfect rhythm, dropping the lead men and forcing the rest to stumble over bodies in panic. Grenades arced from upper floors, bouncing across rubble before detonating, flashes of orange and bursts of snow-white dust that swallowed screams. Yet the Germans were not novices. Once the shock passed, discipline reasserted itself. Officers bellowed commands, machine gun teams pressed forward, and assault pioneers moved into cover positions to prepare a breach. The initial wave had been shattered, but the second wave approached with caution. Weapons raised, eyes sharp, their movements now methodical. They knew they were facing a hidden defensive position. They did not yet know it was only 1 platoon. Mikhail expected this shift. He repositioned his men quickly, signaling them to hold fire until the Germans committed to the entry points. Ammunition was already dwindling. Their strength had to come from forcing the enemy into predictable reactions. He whispered to his radio operator, "Tell the right flank to conserve rounds. They will try the windows next." The Germans did exactly that. A squad approached a collapsed window frame, preparing to throw grenades inside, but Mikhail's sapper, Corporal Andrei, had wired a small explosive trap beneath the rubble. When the squad stepped on it, the device detonated with a sharp, concussive blast that threw bodies and debris into the street. Those who survived the shock stumbled backward as Soviet rifles picked them off one by one. For a moment, the street fell quiet except for the crackling flames and the drifting moans of wounded men. The first German assault had failed, decisively, brutally, unexpectedly. But Mikhail's expression did not change. This was only the beginning. 3,000 Germans were coming, and the second wave was forming beyond the smoke. The pause between the first and second German assaults lasted no more than a minute, but to the men inside Building 47, it felt like the stretching of time itself, the fragile silence that follows an explosion when the mind tries to reorder the chaos it has just survived. Smoke drifted across the street like thin veils, carrying the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder. The bodies of the first wave lay scattered, half buried in rubble, their helmets glinting faintly in the dull winter sun. But none of this deceived Mikhail Sokolov. He knew the Germans were not discouraged. They were adjusting, calculating, preparing to hit harder, smarter, and in far greater numbers. From the second floor, Sergeant Morozov peered through a hole in the wall. "Movement," he whispered. "Lots of movement." Andrei, the sapper, checked his makeshift explosives. "They'll come in force this time. They'll want to crush us before they lose momentum." Mikhail nodded. "We change positions. Every man moves. They'll target where they saw the muzzle flashes." This was one of the secrets to defending Stalingrad. Never let the enemy memorize your breathing. A static defender died. A fluid defender became a ghost the enemy could not pin down. In this shattered city, invisibility was more powerful than numbers. As his men shifted behind new rubble piles and collapsed staircases, the German artillery began. It wasn't a full barrage. They didn't want to pulverize the building entirely. They still believed it housed a larger Soviet force, perhaps an entire company, and destroying it blindly risked blocking their own advance. Instead, they used targeted shelling, sending mortar rounds that crashed into the upper floors with thunderous cracks, shaking dust loose from the beams and filling the air with bitter concrete powder. Each hit collapsed more of the building, but each collapse created new angles, new shadows, new defensive pockets. Then came the second infantry wave. This time the Germans advanced with tactical precision. 3 columns, staggered, machine gunners covering flanks, pioneers carrying flamethrowers and demolition charges. The hum of a nearby Panzer engine signaled armored support, though the narrow, rubble-choked street prevented it from moving closer. Still, its presence alone boosted German morale. Surely, no small Soviet unit could withstand this. Mikhail observed them quietly from a crack in the first floor. He watched how they moved, how they communicated, how they scanned windows before advancing. These were hardened troops, men who had fought in Kiev, in Smolensk, in Kharkov, men who had seen Soviet defenses break again and again. They did not expect to be tested here by 23 exhausted soldiers hiding inside a skeleton of brick and metal. The Germans approached slowly, rifles raised, boots crunching over ice and shattered glass. They spread out in deliberate arcs, preparing to surround the building. Mikhail signaled his riflemen. "Aim low. We bring their front rank down first. Machine guns hold fire until I say, let them commit." The Germans committed. The ambush erupted. Private Leonid opened the volley with a clean shot that cracked through the silence and dropped a German squad leader instantly. His men froze. And that hesitation was all Mikhail needed. Now! Machine guns thundered from 2 sides of the building, creating a deadly crossfire that caught the Germans mid-step. The street exploded with movement, bodies diving for cover, bullets sparking off metal, fragments of masonry bursting apart as rounds struck the walls. The Germans returned fire, but their angles were poor, their formation disrupted, and the confusion spread like wildfire. Yet this time, They did not break. A group of assault pioneers rushed the southern entrance, tossing grenades through a smashed doorway. The blasts shook the floor, sending dust pouring down like ash. Mikhail immediately repositioned 3 men to block the breach. "Hold that gap," he ordered. "If they enter, we fall back room by room." Inside the choke point, the fight turned brutal. Germans attempted to climb over fallen beams, only to be met with close-range fire from rifles and a stolen flamethrower that Private Yuri ignited with grim resolve. Flames roared through the narrow corridor, forcing the attackers to retreat screaming, their silhouettes twisting in firelight. But the Germans weren't finished. A squad attempted to scale the outer wall using debris as makeshift steps, hoping to break in through the second floor. Morozov spotted them and opened fire, cutting down the climbers and sending their bodies tumbling back into the snow. And still, they pushed. Wave after wave surged against the ruins, driven by commanders shouting above the din. The platoon fought like a single organism, shifting as Mikhail directed, conserving ammunition, making every shot deliberate. But the strain was mounting. Ammunition boxes were nearly empty. Several men were wounded. The building shook with every detonation. After 30 relentless minutes, the second German assault finally withdrew, dragging their wounded and leaving dozens behind. Inside Building 47, Mikhail scanned his men. They were bruised, bleeding, coughing dust, but alive. "This is only Wave 2, he murmured to himself. Wave 3 was forming, and it would be worse. The lull before the third assault felt heavier than the fighting itself. Smoke seeped through the shattered windows of Building 47, drifting in slow, ghost-like ribbons that stung the eyes and clung to the throat. Outside, the moans of wounded Germans echoed faintly across the rubble-strewn street, mixing with the crackle of small fires and the distant thud of artillery rolling somewhere deeper in the city. Stalingrad never truly went quiet, but the temporary pause in direct combat created a silence that pressed against the men like a weight. Inside the ruins, Mikhail's platoon moved with the weary coordination of men who had been fighting for what felt like days rather than hours. They checked magazines, redistributed ammunition from the fallen, shifted positions once again, and tended to the wounded. 3 men had significant injuries: shrapnel embedded in flesh, burns up the arms from a grenade blast, and a badly bruised leg that made movement painful. But none were incapacitated. In Stalingrad, pain did not remove a man from the fight. Only death did. Mikhail crouched beside Corporal Andrei as the sapper hastily wired another trip charge into a pile of debris. "This one will slow them," Andrei said, voice hoarse. "It needs to do more than slow," Mikhail replied. "Wave 3 will be the heaviest. They'll want to crush us quickly before they lose too many more men." He had no illusions. The first waves had not just been probes, they had been full-strength assaults, and they had failed. That meant the Germans would now escalate to overwhelming force. Their commanders would assume a fortified strongpoint was hidden in this sector, likely a battalion or more. They would not suspect 23 men were holding the line. From the upper floor, Sergeant Morozov called down, "Lieutenant, armor on the move. I hear engines." The men tensed. The narrow street might restrict heavy vehicles, but a Panzer IV or even a light assault gun could collapse what remained of the building if it got close enough. Mikhail climbed to the second floor, peering through a crack in the wall. On the far side of the square, a column of German infantry was gathering behind a Panzer III. The tank's turret rotated slowly, scanning the rubble, its engine rattling like an animal preparing to pounce. More infantry assembled behind it, at least a full company. Mikhail guessed the total force now preparing to advance numbered near 1,000, and this was only a portion of the 3,000 reported in the district. He returned to his men. "Positions. This will be their biggest push." When the Germans attacked, they came with a coordination and ferocity that surpassed the earlier waves. The Panzer fired first, its shells striking the lower wall and blasting a chunk of brick into dust. The building groaned like a living thing. Floor beams shuddered. Snow and debris rained from the ceiling. Then the infantry charged. This wave did not hesitate. They sprinted across open ground under covering fire from machine guns set up behind fallen masonry. Mortar rounds arced overhead and slammed into the upper levels, shredding more of the walls. German pioneers carrying flamethrowers advanced in pairs, ready to sweep the interior with fire. The air filled with the metallic clang of shrapnel, the crack of rifles, the shouting of men trying to drown out fear with noise. Mikhail shouted above the chaos, "Aim for the flamethrowers first! They cannot reach the entrances!" His men obeyed instantly. Private Yuri dropped the first pair with a clean shot that ignited the pressurized fuel tank on one pioneer's back, sending a violent burst of flames skyward. Another flamethrower team advanced from the east side. Corporal Andrei detonated one of his explosives, obliterating the entire squad in a spray of rubble and dirt. But for every group the Soviets stopped, more advanced. The sheer number of attackers was overwhelming. Germans reached the base of the building, taking cover behind collapsed walls, tossing grenades through any opening they could find. One grenade bounced near a firing position. Leonid grabbed it and hurled it back seconds before detonation, the shockwave knocking him flat. The Panzer III advanced slowly, firing again. This time the shell punched through the outer wall, exploding inside the second floor. Morozov screamed as shrapnel tore across his shoulder and arm, blood spattering across the floorboards. Two riflemen dragged him deeper into the ruin as Mikhail took over the machine gun placement, firing downwards at Germans attempting to breach a side entrance. Then came the moment that nearly broke them. A squad of German pioneers managed to reach the western doorway, planting charges against the weakened wall. Mikhail saw them too late. He fired, hitting one, but the others fled before detonation. The explosion ripped open an entire corner of Building 47. The shockwave hurled men off their positions, collapsing part of the staircase and sending dust billowing like a volcanic eruption. For several seconds, visibility was zero. The Germans roared in triumph, believing they had opened the path to overrun the defenders. Mikhail forced himself to his feet, coughing, ears ringing. He shouted through the haze, "Hold the breach! Stop them now!" His remaining uninjured men rallied, dragging machine guns into new positions and firing blindly at first, then with precision as the dust cleared. Germans attempting to rush the opening fell in heaps, their bodies forming a grisly barrier that slowed those behind them. It was chaos. It was madness. It was Stalingrad. But the line held. After 15 minutes of brutal close combat, the third German wave faltered, then retreated, dragging their wounded and leaving the dead piled so high the attackers could barely step over them. Inside the ruins, the Soviet platoon was barely standing, bloodied, exhausted, desperate. And yet they were still there. Wave 3 had not broken them, but Wave 4 was coming, and the Germans were now furious. The fourth German assault began before the dust from the third had fully settled. There was no pause, no regrouping, no chance for Mikhail's men to catch their breath. German officers were screaming now, not with discipline, but with anger. The humiliation of failing 3 times against what they still believed was a large Soviet force drove them into a frenzy that replaced tactics with sheer, punishing aggression. The sun hung low behind the smoke, turning the street into a dim corridor of shifting shadows. And through those shadows came the shapes of hundreds of German soldiers, advancing in a relentless tide. Blood trickled down Mikhail's temple, though he didn't remember when he had been cut. His ears rang from the recent explosion, one side of his coat was scorched, and his hands shook with exhaustion. But his voice remained steady as he moved through the rubble, checking on each injured or uninjured man. Positions. This is the last wave we can hold. Make every shot count. His platoon was reduced to 15 effective fighters. The others were wounded but not broken, and insisted on staying in the line, even if they could hold only a single rifle or pass ammunition. No one asked to leave. In Stalingrad, there was nowhere to go. There was only forward or death. Outside, a German horn sounded, a low, guttural blast that echoed through the ruins like a declaration of vengeance. Then they came. The fourth assault was unlike the previous ones. This time, the Germans fired continuously as they advanced, a rolling barrage of rifle, machine gun, and mortar fire meant to crush anything still alive inside Building 47. Bullets tore through gaps in the walls, ricocheting off metal beams and sending splinters of brick across the floor. Mortar rounds slammed into the upper levels, collapsing what remained of the third floor in a thunderous cascade of rubble. The defenders ducked instinctively as chunks of masonry fell around them. The Germans reached the base of the building almost without resistance, not because the Soviets weren't fighting, but because Mikhail had ordered them to hold fire until the enemy entered the web of crossfire he had restructured after the explosion. The Germans, emboldened by the apparent weakening of Soviet defenses, surged forward in dense groups. That was the moment Mikhail had been waiting for. Now! The building roared. 3 machine guns opened simultaneously, their firing arcs intersecting perfectly along the entrance corridors. Germans at the front fell instantly, their bodies piling so rapidly that those behind stumbled over them in confusion. Riflemen fired from new, unexpected angles, from collapsed staircases, from the edges of broken floors, from behind makeshift barricades of rebar and sandbags. The platoon fought not like a unit, but like a dozen individual traps springing at once. Grenades arced through the air, thrown by both sides. One German grenade landed close to Private Leonid, only for the wounded Sergeant Morozov, half-conscious, barely able to stand, to lunge forward and kick it into the corner before it detonated, absorbing most of the blast behind a slab of concrete. The act stunned the nearby men. Heroism in Stalingrad often came from instinct, not thought. Still, the Germans pushed. They tried to climb through the new breach created by the earlier explosion, only to be met with the last of Andrei's explosives, a blast so violent it shook the entire western wall and sent debris raining down on both attackers and defenders. Smoke turned the air thick, choking, impossible to see through. Then came the worst sound of all, the grinding engine of the Panzer, III finally managing to force its way closer, using debris as traction, its turret aligned with the building's southern wall. "Down!" Mikhail shouted. The shell struck. The explosion ripped open another massive section of the building. Dust swallowed everything. Men screamed. The world trembled. The room spun. For a moment, Mikhail believed the entire structure would collapse, but it didn't. When the dust thinned, he saw the damage. Catastrophic, but not total. The platoon had been thrown in every direction. Some lay dazed, bleeding, struggling to rise, but none had fled. None had surrendered. Outside, the Germans saw the destruction and charged with renewed fury, believing victory finally within their grasp. Mikhail wiped blood from his lips, steadied himself against a beam, and shouted with a voice that cut through the chaos, "Hold! If we stand now, they break!" His men rose, limping, coughing, bloodied, shaking, and fired. It was no longer a battle. It was a final, desperate, human refusal. And then something shifted. Through the smoke, through the din of battle, a distant rumble grew louder. Not German engines, but Soviet trucks moving fast. Reinforcements. A fresh company sprinted into the district, rifles ready, their arrival the result of the German attack exposing their own positions on the flank. The Germans hesitated, then faltered, then broke. They retreated in a chaotic wave, abandoning their wounded, shouting in disbelief that so few defenders had held them off for so long. Inside Building 47, silence slowly returned. Mikhail sank to his knees. His men slumped against rubble, breathing like survivors of a shipwreck. 15 remained standing. They had stopped 3,000, and in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, a single destroyed building had become the place where a platoon of ordinary men carved their names into history, not with numbers, ranks, or medals, but with endurance that defied all sense. It was never strength that won the day. It was refusal, the refusal to break, the refusal to yield. the refusal to die unseen in the rubble of a city that demanded everything but gave back legend.